Hi there. This video is going to be about working on building block number 7 in our building blocks class. And this block is entitled Mock Cable. It sort of looks like we're producing cables here, but we're not. It's merely a method of yarn overs and passing slipped stitches over. So those are the main techniques that we're going to want to take from practicing this block. That we're doing yarn overs and passing slipped stitches. And we'll go over those as we get into the body of the block. Once again, we have a setup row that is worked with increases, knit front and back increases. And I have gone ahead and cast on 48 stitches, done the seed stitch border for 6 rows, and then we're going to work the setup row once, proceed to row 2 of our body pattern, then row 3, 4, come back to row 1, and so forth, repeating it 14 times plus an additional row 1 before we then decrease back down to our original number of stitches to work the top border. So let's go ahead and just review real quickly how we do that knit front and back increase across that setup row. One of the reasons we're doing that is because the way this pattern behaves once we've finished it is that it's going to kind of pull together. So in order to get your body stitches to lay at the same width as your border stitches, you're going to need to increase rows going across. Now, one of the principles we're also going to go over is that as we go through our body stitches, the number of stitches is going to change depending on what row you've just completed. But we'll talk about that a bit more as we get to that part. So I've worked a border in just some scrap yarn that I had around, just so that I can demonstrate for you the setup row. So, moving our book out of the way, I've got a couple of stitch markers here that I'm going to use to denote my border stitches. That's not something that you have to do, but you might find it helpful, particularly when you get to the final 4 stitches, just so that you know that those are your border. So let's start off with our seed stitch here. Knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. And I'll go ahead and place a marker on my needle. Now in the setup row, we're going to knit 3, knit front and back, knit 2, and then repeat that until our last repeat has knit 3 instead of knit 2, and then our final 4 border stitches. So first we'll knit 3. There's 2, 3. Now we're going to do that increase, knitting into the front of the stitch, then turning it over and knitting into the back of the stitch again. Knit 2. Once again, we go in the front of the stitch as normal, wrap the yarn, pull through. Without pulling the stitch off of my left hand needle, I'm going to come back through the back of that stitch, wrap again. Oops, I lost my wrap. So I'll just go back in, wrap again, pull it up and off. I've created 2 stitches from where there was 1 stitch before. Knit 2, knit front and back, knit 2, and so on all the way across the row until that final repeat. We're going to knit 3, place a marker, and then our final 4 border stitches. Okay? So having done that, if you go ahead and count your stitches when you're done, you will have 52 stitches in between your markers. So 60 stitches total if you include your 8 border stitches, 4 on each side. Moving on to the body, I've already worked a few repeats of this pattern. When you work your first row 2, it's just going to be alternating knit 2, purl 3, knit 2. Very self-explanatory all the way across. Rows 3 and 4 are where we're going to need to focus a little bit on doing some different manipulations of the stitches. But I'm going to start here with a row 1 just to show you, having done some yarn overs in row 4, the stitches might look a little bit different when you come back to do those ordinary knits and purls. So let's take a look here. Now I haven't put markers in for my border stitches. I don't really have difficulty keeping track, but if it helps you, then I would encourage you to go ahead and do that. So here are our 4 border stitches. Now I'm going to start with purl 2, knit 3, purl 2, repeating all the way across these 52 body stitches. All right, so I'm going to purl 2. Here we come to our knit 3. And you can see that maybe this looks a little bit funny because there's this yarn over stitch in between these 2 stitches. So when I go to knit 3, I'm going to knit this first one, then I'm going to knit into that yarn over, and then the 3rd stitch. And you can see how sometimes the yarn over kind of gets hung up on the neighboring stitch, but you're just always going to know that the yarn over is the center stitch in your knit 3. And that is to produce these little holes in the center of your mock cable. So that's why, you know, the yarn over stitch is going to need to be in the center of that 3 knit stitches. All right. So once again, I'm going to purl 2, going to knit 3, there's our yarn over, purl 2, knit 3. Again, see how these 2 stitches are kind of crisscrossed over each other, but I know that my yarn over is the next one I want to knit into. So I grab it, knit it, and then knit the final one. All right. Now say something has happened and maybe in that last repeat of row 4 you forgot to do your yarn over and you were just sort of in the zone and doing you know, your knits and purls, and you forgot a yarn over in the middle of one. When I'm gonna manipulate this a little bit, when you got to that part where you had forgotten the yarn over, or maybe the yarn over dropped or whatever happened, it might look like this, and you'd have these 2 purl stitches and then just 2 knit stitches. So I don't need to rip all the way back to the preceding row in order to fix this mistake. I am just going to knit that first one, Now I know in the preceding row, there should have been a yarn over stitch in the middle here. So I'm just going to grab that strand that goes between my stitches, loop it up on my needle so that it looks like a yarn over stitch, and go ahead and knit it, and knit the next one, and I have repaired the mistake. No need to go back and redo it all. And that'll become obvious if you get to a point where you're like, oh no, I don't have 3 stitches to knit. I just have a repeat of 2 knit stitches, 2 purl stitches. You can certainly grab the stitch from between and just pull it on up and correct your mistake. So I'll show that one more time here. I'm going to, likewise, let's say I knit the first stitch and I'm going to purposely drop that yarn over, because sometimes that happens. You have a stitch accidentally slip off, maybe you don't grab it in time, or what have you, whatever it is that happens. If that yarn over falls off, you can see this strand, when I pull it, I pull this next stitch tighter because it's from that preceding row. I'll show that from the back also. So here's that strand that goes between the preceding and the following stitch. Once again, I'm just going to grab it, see how that stitch pulls tighter, and I can loop it right up and over my needle so that I can work it. Now what you don't want to do is twist it the wrong way, because it's going to make your yarn over lean in a different direction. I mean, it wouldn't be the worst thing ever to happen, but it's better to have your stitch facing the correct direction. All right, and that is all there is to that. When you finish row 1, you are going to have 52 body stitches. Now, if you're able to do the purl 2, knit 3, purl 2 all the way across until your final 4 border stitches, you should have the correct number of stitches. So it wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily need to count them every time, as long as everything comes out correctly. If you prefer to count every time and it makes you feel more comfortable with what you're doing, then by all means, go ahead and do that. You're going to have 52 stitches after row 1, after row 2. We'll go over row 3 in just a moment, where we do some decreases. So you'll go down to 42 body stitches. Then in row 4, we do some yarn overs that increase the number of stitches back up to 52. The reason we increase and decrease by 10 stitches at a go is that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 columns where we're doing those yarn overs that create stitches and the pass slip stitch over that takes away a stitch 10 times across the pattern of the block. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the camera, and when I come back we'll be doing a row 3. Row 2 is very self-explanatory. It's just knit 2, purl 3, knit 2 all the way across. So it's just how the stitches lie on the back of your block. You can see very clearly our columns of knit 3, or excuse me, I said that incorrectly. Purl 3, knit 2, purl 3, knit 2, and so on all the way across. Okay? So when I come back, we will do row 3. Okay, so here we are back and ready to start row 3. So row 3, I'm going to work my 4 border stitches, and then the body stitches are purl 2, slip 1, so I'll slip as if to purl, not knitting the stitch. Knit 2, pass the slipped stitch over, purl 2, and repeat all the way across. Having slipped those stitches over, it will result in having only 42 body stitches remaining. When we slip a stitch, if there are no other instructions offered, that means we always slip as if to purl. So you're going to insert your needle as if you were going to purl that stitch and then slip it off the needle. I'll demonstrate right now. So here are my 4 border stitches. Purl 2. Now I'm going to move my yarn, my working yarn, to the back of my work. I don't want it to get stuck up here at the front. So having purled that stitch, my working yarn goes to the back. I'm now going to slip the next stitch as if I were purling it. I'm not going to do anything to it, just let it hang there. Then going to knit the next 2 stitches. I'm going to take that stitch that I slipped and I'm going to pass it up and over the other 2 stitches, off the tip of my needle, and drop around it. You can see how that is creating this look from previous rows where it looks as if we've maybe cabled the stitches, but instead we're just taking it and slipping it over, and it kind of ties those following 2 stitches together. Purl 2. Once again, moving my yarn to the back, slip as if to purl, knit those following 2 stitches, grab that slipped stitch, the 3rd stitch on my right hand needle, bring it up and over the tip of my needle to kind of tie that little chain, almost make a link in the chain. Purl 2, move my yarn to the back, slip 1, knit the next 2, up and over. Purl 2, slip, knit, pass up and over. All right, so you can see how in each of these sort of chain link columns, each time I had 3 stitches before, I now have only 2 stitches. So for every one of these columns, I am reducing by 1 stitch, which is why when we end row 3, there will only be 42 stitches remaining. So if I purl and accidentally leave the yarn at the front of my work before I slip, and then I go to knit, it would carry over and create another yarn over, and I'd have a bit of a mess. So to fix that problem, I would just go ahead and slip the stitch back over, move my yarn back, slip that stitch, and continue on. Now what if I don't get my stitch passed over properly, or maybe my front stitch drops in the process of trying to pass it over? You can just carefully, I kind of squeeze the work with my left hand. I would pull my right hand needle out, pull the stitch out from up and over, thread those stitches back on, making sure I have 3. See where I've split the strand here? I'm just gonna get it back on there all intact. I'm gonna make sure this one isn't twisted incorrectly. Again, I've got a split strand there, so I just kind of move it back and forth until it's all good. My working yarn dropped out of this final stitch, so I'm just going to go ahead, and you can see where my working yarn is tightening up the second stitch, but I can go ahead and work that one again and just give it another try. Okay, so we just repeat that all the way across, and then I will demonstrate how to work row 4, which is where we put the stitches back that we just reduced on this row. So once we complete row 4, we'll be back to 52 body stitches once more, because we're going to add them back in as yarn overs in the center of each of our sort of chain looking columns. It helps somewhat when you're working stitch patterns like this to have needles with relatively sharp tips. It just makes it easier to grab stitches and pull them up and over. But regardless of what type of needles you favor, it will be pretty easy to do with this thickness of yarn. And just, you know, be patient with yourself. Maybe take it slowly through the first repeat, and then you'll become more comfortable with it as you go along. So row 4, we're going to knit 2, purl 1, yarn over, purl 1, knit 2. Now if you can recall, when we've done yarn overs before in previous blocks, when a yarn over is followed by a knit stitch, we often just bring the working yarn up to the front of the work, and then when you knit the next stitch, it automatically creates a yarn over. When the yarn over is followed with a purl stitch, you're going to have to go up and over the needle. And I'll demonstrate exactly what I mean by that in just a moment here. So here are my 4 seed stitch border stitches. Now I'm going to knit this first stitch. I would knit 2 as part of the pattern, but I'm going to demonstrate really quickly what we normally do, what we have done previously for yarn overs when they're followed by a knit stitch. So don't let this confuse you. This isn't part of the pattern. This is just me demonstrating really quickly that when we have done yarn overs in previous blocks, we've just brought the yarn up to the front of the work, and then when we go to knit the following stitch, it automatically creates that yarn over. That is not how we're going to yarn over for this block. So having done my knit 2, I'm going to purl 1, bring the yarn up and over my needle so that it's back at the front of my work to purl the following stitch. You can see where there were 2 purl stitches before, I now have that yarn over in the center that I just created. That will result in these nice little holes that are all through the middle of each of these sort of chain links. So it adds the stitches back. It's also going to create that nice little hole that is sort of decorative to the pattern. So for every single one of those columns, we're adding another stitch back, which is what takes us from 42 back to 52 body stitches again. All right, so we're going to knit 2, purl 1, yarn over, purl 1, and there I've created that yarn over. Knit 2, purl 1, yarn over, purl 1, knit 2, purl 1, yarn over, purl 1, knit 2, purl 1, yarn over, purl 1. And it'll feel more natural the more you do it. And like I said, maybe you fall into a rhythm where you forget to do the yarn over in one of these columns. Well, when you get to the following row, you'll notice that there aren't 3 stitches to knit, and you can just pull up that strand from in between to become your yarn over, as I showed you when we were working row 1 previously. So you want to try and remember your yarn over. It's part of the instructions, but you know, sometimes mistakes happen. And I just want you to know that that is not catastrophic. It's a pretty easy fix. All right. So having completed rows 3 and 4, we will then repeat those rows 14 times. And once we've done them, oops, see there, I just forgot my yarn over because I'm sitting here talking. Having done them 14 times, we will then do one more row 1 and then the decreased row. So how do we know we've done 14 repeats? How do you know how many repeats you have done up until that point? Well, you can just count how many of these little links you have. So if I pull apart my work, I can see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 repeats that I've done so far. And I have 7 more to do. I'm on a row 4 of my 8th repeat, or no, excuse me, the 7th repeat. And you can see on here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 little links in that chain, and that's how you know that you've done 14 repeats. You can keep track, you know, use a row counter. You can make little hashtags on a post-it that you stick to your book, whatever helps you. But also know that even if you don't keep track, you can just count and you'll be right back on track. All right. How can you tell what row that you're on if you lose track of where you are in the book? Maybe your row counter, you know, gets reset, or if you're using a post-it or some highlighter tape, it falls off, what have you. You can take a look at your work and know what row you're about to do. Oops, I lost a stitch there. I'm going to grab that guy real quick. I had one fall off the end of my needle. There we go. So I can see here that my yarn is positioned such that I'm ready to work a right side row. Right side rows are either row 1 or row 3. Well, if I'm working row 3, then I should be ready to slip 1, knit 2, pass slip stitch over. But taking a look at my work, I can see that my columns have a new yarn over here. So that means I'm going to need to knit into that yarn over. I can see, having just completed those yarn overs, I just finished a row 4. That means I'm ready to start row 1. Okay? If there aren't new yarn overs right there, if everything has already been knit, then you're ready to work a row 3. Likewise, if you're on a wrong side row and you see that your purl columns have 3 stitches, then you're ready to work a row 2, because you're going to purl 3, knit 2 as part of the pattern. If your purl columns have only 2 stitches because you've just done this row 3 with the slip 1, knit 2, pass slip stitch over manipulation, then your purl columns will only have 2 stitches, and that means you're ready to work a row 4, and you're going to create that yarn over to make those purl columns 3 stitches once more. Okay, I hope that helps, and when I turn the camera back on, I will have the block nearly completed. We'll be ready to work the decrease row to go back down to our original number of stitches that we cast on. All right. Okay, so here I am back again, having done 14 repeats of that mock cable patterned section. You can see how when I just put the block here, it does draw in a little bit through the center. That's just due to the ribbed texture of this. But when I block it out, it's really going to show off the texture and you know, even out the size of the block to be the same as all the others. So we're ready now to do the decrease row. I have just completed row 1 for the final time. So I'm just going to demonstrate real quickly how to go ahead and decrease those stitches back down to where we only have 40 body stitches and a total of 48 stitches once again. After that, the top border will just be worked for 5 rows of seed stitch, just like every other block, and then bound off in pattern. So for that decrease row, once again, seed stitch is worked over those first 4 stitches. And then we're going to purl 3, purl 2 together, purl 2, repeating it all the way across the body stitches until that final repeat ends with purl 3 instead of purl 2. So we start with purl 3 and we end with purl 3. Oops, get my yarn up to the front here. So purl 3, and then I'm just going to stick my needle through 2 stitches, wrap the yarn, and purl those 2 together. And then I'm going to purl 2. Once again, here are 2 stitches, needle tip goes through both of them, wrap the yarn, pull through both to get 1 stitch where I had 2 before. And in this manner, we're just going to go all the way across, decreasing those stitches back down. And when you finish, you should have a total of 48 stitches, including your border. If you don't include your border stitches, there are going to be 40 body stitches. Okay? And when I turn the camera back on, I'll have a block square to show you, and we'll see what that looks like all finished. All right. All right, so here we are. I have the finished block all pinned out. It's still a little bit damp, but you can see I've got it pinned out to the dimensions of my taped off square, so that it should be a 12 by 12 block, just like all the others. Okay, I hope you did well with this one, and I'll see you back again for the next block. Thanks.